I'm Aspecticor, and today I'm here to talk about why the US is cooked. In other words, I want to talk about why the US is already much further down the road to authoritarianism than most Americans realize. You might think I'm going to talk about tariffs. You might think I'm going to talk about Elon and Doge and its impact on the government. You might have a three-way parlay on those two things plus Kid Rock. But what I'm talking about today is not that. I'm not going to be talking about Canada or Greenland or any of the crazy entertaining shit like insider trading. I'm here to talk about something that's much less interesting and, in my opinion, much more important. I'm here to talk about the rule of law. Don't get me wrong, I understand. I know that Supreme Court decisions get a lot of press. I would estimate that there's actually a very, very small proportion of people, even of those informed, who take the time to read through these because they're boring as okay? Look at this. Per curiam? I don't know what that means, bro. There's in-text citations, there's Latin, and there's English words that I just don't even recognize. But buried in these is a really concerning trend, and it's something I want to talk about today. The whole idea behind the executive branch not being dictatorial and having a dictator as Trump is that the other branches of government, like the legislative branch, which has the Senate and the House of Representatives, and the judicial branch, have control over the actions of one another. Since they're all bound by the Constitution, if they play by the rules, it ensures that America will not fall under a dictatorial regime. This is a system called checks and balances, and it's the reasoning that a lot of people give for why they have hope that Donald Trump won't completely take over the US. Firstly, I'm going to be talking about freedom of speech and expression rights and the fall of academic institutions. Secondly, I'm going to be discussing the erosion of due process and the deportation machine. And thirdly, I'm going to be talking about the death of democratic elections. When you think of America, you think of freedom. The freedom to hold an opinion and express it, even if it's an opinion that the government doesn't like. The thing is, the freedoms that allow you to assemble and to protest against the actions of your government are already in the process of being dismantled. It's just happening to a different group of protesters. The most notable case of this is Mahmoud Khalil. He's a 30-year-old master's student who was set to graduate this year, who became involved in the pro-Palestine protests at Columbia. He was arrested by ICE officers who were actually unaware of his immigration status, but detained him anyways. He faced no criminal charges and doesn't to this day, and he spent the last 30 days in ICE custody. This is what the White House said after Mahmoud was arrested and detained. ICE proudly apprehended and detained Mahmoud Khalil, a radical foreign pro-Hamas student on the campus of Columbia University. This is the first arrest of many to come. In October of 2023, after the attack on Israel, Mahmoud became involved in the pro-Palestine movement that many of you probably remember happening on the internet and across university campuses all across the country. April 30th, 2024, the next year, he received an email from Columbia that actually suspended him. But just a day later, Columbia unsuspended him after reviewing the evidence. The university's president personally called him to apologize for the mistake, and administrators described Khalil as a principled, good-faith negotiator who worked with them to reduce encampments. But on March 8th, at 8:30 p.m., multiple ICE officers took him from the lobby of his apartment building in Columbia University housing. Khalil had a conversation with his attorney before he was arrested, and the attorney spoke to the ICE officer. The attorney informed the agent that Khalil was a permanent resident of the US and he was in possession of a green card. She insisted that she needed to see a warrant before he was arrested or detained. The agent hung up the phone. Although the lawyer said that they later showed her a warrant, Khalil's wife said they were not shown a warrant and that within minutes they had handcuffed Mahmoud, took him out into the street, and forced him into an unmarked car. A Columbia spokesperson said law enforcement agents must produce a warrant before entering university property, but they had declined to say whether the university received a warrant. They also declined to comment on the arrest. So after the government filed to have the case heard in front of much more conservative courts in New Jersey and Louisiana, where he'd actually been transported, the U.S. District Judge ruled on March 12th that he was not to be removed from the country and that he had to be given 2 privileged phone calls with his lawyer. Because 4 days after his arrest, he still hadn't been given a chance to confer with an attorney privately. On April 8th, Mahmoud Khalil had an immigration hearing in Louisiana. This was just days ago, with Judge Jamie Comins. In the hearing, Comins gave the government 24 hours to provide Khalil's lawyers with evidence that he's removable. The judge also set another hearing for April 11th, tomorrow, giving Khalil's lawyers time to respond. During the hearing, a dozen allegations were levied against Khalil, including that he was a native of Syria and a citizen of Algeria, that he withheld information from DHS about his alleged membership in Columbia University Apartheid Divest, and that his, quote, presence or activities in the United States would have serious adverse foreign policy consequences. Khalil's lawyer responded deny to each allegation. I want to take a second to read a letter from his wife. She's a doctor, a dentist, and she's currently pregnant with Mahmoud's child. Exactly a month ago, you were taken from me. This is the longest we have been apart since we got married. I miss you more and more every day. And as the days draw us closer to the arrival of our child, I am haunted by the uncertainty that looms over me. The possibility that you might not be there for this monumental moment. Every kick, every cramp. Sorry. Every kick, every cramp, every small flutter I feel inside of me serves as an inescapable reminder of the family we've dreamed of building together. And yet, I am left to navigate this profound journey alone, while you endure the cruel and unjust confines of a detention center. I could not be more proud of you, Mahmoud. You embody everything I ever hoped for in a partner, and the father of my children. What more could I ask for as a role model for our children than a man who, with unwavering convictions, stands up for the liberation of his people, fully cognizant of the consequences of speaking truth to power? I wanted to read that because among all of these economic indicators and broad tariff orders, it's very easy to lose sight of the people who are already being affected by this administration. As of today, over 600 students have had their visas revoked. This is double the figure quoted by Rubio just 2 weeks ago. Again, this is today's news, April 10th, 2025. Many of them are arrested without warning by plainclothes ICE officers. Now, earlier today, despite having been ordered to provide Khalil's lawyer with evidence against him, the government submitted a 2-page memo from Marco Rubio, stating that Khalil's presence in the U.S. undermines, quote, U.S. policy to combat anti-Semitism around the world and in the United States, in addition to efforts to protect Jewish students from harassment and violence. The memo did not allege that Khalil had done anything illegal. Instead, it stated that Khalil should be deported due to past, current, or expected beliefs, statements, or associations that are otherwise lawful. There's a huge number of universities that are facing cuts in funding, and it's on the basis of allowing students to protest in favor of Palestine. Just to list a few, Brown University has $510 million withheld. Columbia just had an additional $400 million in grants suspended yesterday, even though they have bent the knee and complied with almost every single order of the Trump administration. Harvard University has $9 billion of cuts at stake. Cornell University, $1 billion. Northwestern, $790 million. University of Pennsylvania, $175 million. Princeton University, $210 million. And if these universities do not bow to Trump's entire list of commands, they're going to withhold this funding from these academic institutions. And if you don't know, Academic and cultural institutions having freedom are essential for a functioning democracy. It's not just a plus. But even if you accept that premise, there's a question that I'm sure a lot of you had, and it's one I had myself. Are immigrants provided with the same free speech protection that other American residents that are citizens have? Do immigrants have, quote unquote, free speech? And the answer is yes. Unequivocally yes. This is not something that's up for debate. It's a core element of the freedoms that are enshrined in your Constitution, and the government has tried to argue around it. But they've been able to use their accusations of terrorism to supersede his rights. Not only are First Amendment rights under fire and crumbling, so is the institutional academic freedom that serves as a cornerstone of democratic function. The second key argument I want to talk about is that due process, which all people in America, resident, citizen, immigrant, legal or otherwise, are entitled to, is being dismantled. The Trump administration's advoking of emergency powers, their usage of the Alien Enemies Act, and their willingness to requisition legal migrants to a death camp in El Salvador demonstrates that due process is no longer a guarantee for those groups. It was a dangerous and foolish optimism to assume that the incursions on civil rights would stop at legal immigrants. I would say the same of assuming that these civil rights being stripped from people will stop at naturalized citizens or even eventually American citizens who are considered that way through and through. So let's talk about the deportations and death camps. Now, outside of what I'm going to talk about today, the Trump administration has undertaken huge, and I'm talking huge initiatives to try and ramp up the scale of their deportation through rate and scale overall. And combined with their invocation of the Enemy Aliens Act, this does not bode well for immigrants, but also American citizens. They want to run a system that's like Amazon Prime for human beings. What is the Alien Enemies Act anyways? I think if you want to understand the discussion that's happening around a lot of the quote-unquote Venezuelan Tren de Aragua members that have been deported, you need to understand this first. What it is, it's an act from 1798 that gives the president broad, sweeping powers to take non-citizens inside the country and put them inside internment camps, also known as concentration camps. It's been used during times of war in the past. The most recent time it's been used is in World War II, but we'll discuss a bit more about that later. But what's important about this act is that it says in the act itself that it can only be used in times of active war. You have to be at active war with the nation or within a reasonable period of an active conflict to be able to invoke this act. Trump declared that the supposedly huge number of Venezuelan Tren de Aragua members that had come across the border constituted a foreign invasion on the part of the country of Venezuela. Therefore, the USA and Venezuela are currently assumed to be at war right now. Therefore, he's within his rights to act as the president and invoked the Alien Enemies Act. Not only has this never been done before, never, ever, but many legal authorities have confirmed that this reasoning for invoking the act is complete bogus, okay? But the fucked up part is I shouldn't even need to convince you of that. That's how much the Overton window has shifted, and that's how much shit has flooded the zone. America is not at war with Venezuela. We know this. You know this. I know this. This is a truth that the administration wants its citizens to disbelieve. The supposed huge swaths of gang members does not and never would have constituted a foreign invasion. Not only is invoking this act absurd, it's also unprecedented. And I want to really make that clear. Some people will tell you that this type of stuff has been happening all throughout the US's history. It hasn't. Although last time the Alien Enemies Act was used to put American citizens in concentration camps on American soil, this time they have outsourced the job to CCOT, which is a notoriously deadly prison in El Salvador. They're subjected to inhumane conditions. They're beaten, they're held in solitary confinements. On arrival, they get their heads shaved. They're intentionally intermingled with enemy gangs. It's described as a prison. It's described as an internment facility, as a detention center. I want to be very clear. It's a death camp. Hundreds of people are confirmed to have died in this prison just within the last 3 years. And that number is probably wildly underinflated given that there's no transparency whatsoever. 238 men were requisitioned, which is to say kidnapped by ICE, put on a plane, and flown to a death camp in El Salvador. Of those 238, 75% of them had no criminal record. 5% of them had been accused of violent offenses. 5%. But the government has stated that the lack of information about these people is demonstrative, of how dangerous they are. They've continued to label anyone sent to these death camps as violent gang members convicted of terrible crimes. And they say that even if they wanted to get these people back, they couldn't, as El Salvador now has jurisdiction. They say that since the federal judge ordered the plane full of requisitioned migrants to be turned around orally, but not in a written matter, that it didn't really count as an order. And this is not me quoting some White House official popping off at a press conference. These are the arguments that the Department of Justice lawyers brought forward in federal courts. I need to stress the difference of that immensely, okay? This is not like the things that Trump spews at news conferences that are not held to a standard of scrutiny. These are lawyers acting under oath, legally required to represent the views of the Department of Justice. And when they're starting to sound like the Secretary of State or like President Donald Trump, we need to be very concerned. I wish I could laugh about how fucking absurd it is, but I'm reminded of people like Andre Hernandez Romero. He was disappeared out of the country. He was put on a plane to El Salvador. He had his head shaved, his wrists bound, his ankles cuffed. And then he was left in a prison that by the administration's own admission is full of dangerous gang members. The 31-year-old makeup artist had actually fled from Venezuela last year due to concerns about being targeted for his sexuality and his political views. The only reason that we know this man was disappeared off the street is because he didn't show up for an asylum hearing. Because Mr. Romero is not an illegal immigrant. He came to this country legally, seeking asylum through a legal process. And the only way that we know he's in there is because he failed to show up for an asylum hearing and someone saw him in a video. One of the journalists who went there heard him calling out before he was silenced. No one has had direct contact with this man for more than 25 days, almost a month now. In this case, you might have heard of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. He's a husband, father of 3. He was arrested by ICE officers after picking up his child from a relative's house. After being detained, he was requisitioned to the death camp in El Salvador. And just to give you an idea of how the administration has responded to their lawyers admitting in court that his deportation was, quote, an administrative error, I'd like to quote the U.S. press secretary, whatever her name is. I don't even care about her name. She's so evil. Well, first of all, the error that you're referring to was based on a clerical error. It was an administrative error. The administration maintains the position that this individual who was deported to El Salvador will not be returning to our country, was a member of the brutal and vicious MS-13 gang. And these claims are repeated by White House spokespeople, but what's most alarming is that they're being argued by lawyers in the U.S. Supreme Court. After a long, and I'm telling you, I've been following this case for a long time. After a long and drawn out back and forth, today, on April 10th, the Supreme Court ruled that the Department of Justice must return him to the United States so he can face due process. But nobody has had contact with Mr. Garcia. We don't know of his status. We don't know if he's alive. I hope, as strongly as one could, that he is. And that his 3 kids and wife won't be left without the father. I would be lying if I said I wasn't scared that he was dead. And it makes me so sad to think that that's even a possibility. there was a notice by the United States government about a month ago that immigrants should begin to self-deport. And I've heard reports today that anybody who used the app to claim asylum in the US, total of 900,000 people, has been receiving notifications that they will be illegal within a week and that they should self-deport. One of the scariest things, though, to me, is that today the Trump administration talked about planning to put them in the dead category in the Social Security database so that they can't receive benefits. Some of these people have been here for years. And now the administration is going to make it so they can't access credit cards, bank accounts, and other financial services. Whether or not immigrants are being deported under the Alien Enemies Act or not pressed with actual charges and then detained under a provision from an Immigration Act from 1952, like in the case of Mahmoud Khalil, the administration is going to continue to use their emergency powers to deport legal and illegal immigrants alike. Sadly, the best case scenario for many is being deported to their home countries rather than being requisitioned to a death camp in El Salvador. As I said earlier, 900,000 people entered the US legally via the CPB app, and 500,000 of them were told that they have to self-deport by April 24th or face arrest and deportation. This shit is not happening next year. It's almost next week. And to anybody who's not an immigrant, I want to show you this video, which came from a press release today, which is Caroline Leavitt talking about the administration's views on deporting citizens.
President's idea for American citizens to potentially be deported. These would be heinous, violent criminals who have broken our nation's laws repeatedly, and these are violent repeat offenders in American streets. The president has said if it's legal, right, if there is a legal...
There is no possible interpretation of any law in America that allows you to take American citizens and send them to a death camp. I want to be so clear about that. You can't send them outside of the country. It's so, no one has ever said it might be legal.
Pathway to do that. He's not sure. We are not sure if there is.
They're not sure?
It's an idea that he has simply floated and has discussed very publicly as in the effort of transparency.
Finally, let's talk about a fundamental pillar to a democratic society, and my third and final point of why the US is in a much worse place than most people think. Let's talk about free and fair elections. Now, I have been assured by many informed, intelligent, well-meaning Americans that what Trump is doing is terrible, but it will also have really negative impacts on the nationwide approval of Republicans. That we're going to see a big blue wave in the 2026 midterm elections, and that those midterm elections are where we can really turn this ship around. Your midterm elections are in over 570 days as of April 10th, 2025. So for the past month or two, I've been harping that the United States is heading in a direction that will not ensure free and fair elections. But what's that, Aspecticor? You haven't heard about the Wisconsin Supreme Court nomination? Let's go. A huge W in Wisconsin. Democrats win in spite of Elon splurge. Can we talk? I hate splurge. I don't like splurge as a word, you know? Listen, this is a huge win for Democrats. I don't misunderstand me, okay? One of the big benefits of flooding the zone with shit is that it's hard to keep your eye on the ball. And everybody's celebrating a single Supreme Court nomination that was fairly elected, which is apparently a high standard nowadays. But courts in more Republican states are quietly doing away with the rights of voters. This is how North Carolina Republicans are trying to steal an election in broad daylight. I think that many of you probably will not have heard of this because it's boring. Because if you didn't hear about it from me, almost nobody's talking about it. And yet, it's an incredibly important litmus test for how an election might go in a conservative state. So let me break it down for you. Last November, over 5 million North Carolinians cast their vote for the North Carolina Supreme Court nominee. The Democratic candidate, not pictured here, Riggs, pictured on the left here, Riggs, won by 734 votes. So, given that it was so many votes and such a close race, they demanded a recount. And then, after the first recount was certified, with the exact same figure, winning by 734 votes for the Democratic candidate, they demanded another. The results of the second recount were the same. But during the same time that they challenged the first recount, they had actually moved to challenge the legitimacy of over 65,000 voters. On November 15th, the election was completed. It took a while to count, and they found out that the Democrat won by 734 votes. On November 20th, 2024, the same year, 5 days later, the Republicans requested a recount and initiated processes to challenge the 65,000 votes. On December 10th, almost a month later, the second recount was completed, and Griggs, the Democratic nominee, was asserted as the winner. But, based on the Republicans challenging this, on January 22nd, 2025, the North Carolina Supreme Court blocked Riggs' certification as the winner, pending an investigation on whether or not 65,000 ballots should be thrown out for ineligibility. The basis of the eligibility of these votes is how these voters were registered and whether or not they showed specific documentation when they voted. What's important to know is that they were not required to show this documentation at the time of voting. And after the fact, Republicans are deciding to challenge the legitimacy of 65,000 votes, which, by the way, happened to be in districts that voted more for the Democrat, and by the way, happened to target black North Carolinians at a rate of twice North Carolinians. On April 4th, in a 2-1 decision in the North Carolina Court of Appeals, they ruled that 65,000 voters had 15 days to prove their eligibility. And if they didn't do that, if they couldn't get the document in time, if they didn't read the mail, if they were on vacation, if they died, then their votes in the November election would be considered forfeit. Now, we don't need to be lawyers to look at this and see that it's corrupt. But just to make you feel better, the lawyers who have written on this issue, the lawyers contesting these ridiculous requests to throw out 65,000 ballots, they've asserted. Now, very recently, courts in North Carolina suspended the 15-day deadline. 3 days ago, Judge Griffin, the Republican, is choosing to challenge it, which means that we're headed to the Supreme Court. And I want you to look at this as an indicator for how elections might look 100 days from now, 200 days from now, 300 days from now. Now, I want to take you guys back to the discussion about checks and balances, okay? Because any progressive, informed American that I talk to that thinks things are going to get better comes back to this. They come back to their Constitution, they come back to their judicial branch, and they come back to their legislative branch. Not only have the Democrats shown their willingness to roll over in the Senate and the House of Representatives, but the majority of the Senate and House of Representatives is controlled by Republicans. The legislative branch has demonstrated that they will go along with what Trump says. They will go along with what Trump wants to do. And no matter how much the Democrats filibuster to pretend they're blocking a bill and then 10 hours later vote to send fucking $9 billion more dollars to Israel, they've demonstrated that they're not going to do shit. So we look to the judicial branch, because a system of checks and balances would recognize that the U.S. is not at war with Venezuela. A system of checks and balances would prevent legal migrants. It would prevent illegal migrants. It would prevent criminals and innocent citizens alike from being requisitioned to a death camp in El Salvador. It would prevent citizens and other residents from being denied their right to due process and denied their First Amendment rights. The fundamental rights of Americans that give you the freedom to talk shit about the government online or to go to a pride parade are within this system, okay? They're being tried in the district courts, and they're being sent to the Court of Appeals, and they're being put in front of the Supreme Court, and we are losing. I don't know how to say this clearly enough. What's happening in the most boring section of the government has the biggest impact on your ability to live a free life. And I know it's not fucking interesting to sit there and read through an opinion from the Supreme Court of the United States. But when you read through this and you see that one of the justices is saying this fly-by-night approach to the work of the Supreme Court is not only misguided, it is also dangerous. The President of the United States has invoked a centuries-old wartime statute to whisk people away to a notoriously brutal foreign-run prison. For lovers of liberty, this should be quite concerning. I lament that the court appears to have embarked on a new era of procedural variability, and that it has done so in such a casual, inequitable, and in my view, inappropriate manner. At least when the court went off base in the past, it left a record so posterity could see how it went wrong. With more and more of our most significant rulings taking place in the shadows of our emergency docket, today's court leaves less and less of a trace. But make no mistake, we are just as wrong now as we have been in the past, with similarly devastating consequences. It seems we are now less willing to face it. And I want to get ahead of some of the arguments I hear all the time. But Aspect, the US has always been cooked. Aspect, what are you talking about? The rights of citizens have never been a guarantee. You needn't look further than Andrew Jackson and the Trail of Tears, or the Kent State shootings in Ohio in '73, or the Watergate scandal, or even this picture from 2018 showing families locked up at the border in inhumane conditions. But I need to tell you that it's never been like this before. What the Trump administration is doing with its executive actions, the way that it's defied the federal courts, is not a situation that the United States has ever faced. And this isn't just my opinion, okay? This is the opinion of lawyers with years of experience who are analyzing the situation. This is the opinion of Supreme Court justices who are dissenting against recent rulings. Notice that this presentation hasn't mentioned a fraction of the other actions that Trump's administration is undertaking right now that will have devastating effects on government services, civil liberties, the economy, national security. Don't think for a second that I'm underestimating the impact or importance of those issues. But if you want to seriously tell me that I'm an alarmist for saying that America is way more cooked than the vast majority of you realize, and that these infractions won't start happening to American citizens very soon, then I'm expecting you to come with sources. I understand that spending your free time reading through a Supreme Court ruling in detail is less interesting than seeing the movement of the stock markets or the 10-year Treasury bond rate. That the idiotic and ridiculous exploits of Donald Trump and Elon Musk aren't way more entertaining to focus on. But when your rights are being impeded, you don't go to your 401k for help. When the government causes you harm by whisking away a member of your family and sending them to a death camp, you aren't asking Jim Cramer for advice. You rely upon the rule of law. The dismantling of America's legal system and the power of the judicial branch is some of the driest shit I've ever researched in my life. But I also think it's the most important. I've had enough of people who haven't taken the time to read through the pages and pages of official Supreme Court rulings telling me everything is going to be okay. The writing on the wall might be full of legal jargon. It might be boring, but it matters. Time for you to start reading it. So where does that leave us? My assertion remains the same as what it has been for weeks. Despite the appearances of recent SCOTUS rulings, the fine print reveals that they are unlikely to rein in Trump from committing more atrocities. I don't believe that you're making it to fair and free elections in 571 days if things don't change drastically. Without a massive revolt and protest from citizens or a miracle, an act of God, I don't think things are going to change.